the music. And I'd like to go ahead and kick off our second annual Boulder Apple Tree Project Symposium on that excellent note from Jude, just about, you know, the knowledge that we're trying to build with these apple trees, and how much knowledge can specifically be built by folks who are just early in their careers, which is sort of a lot of what we're going to be seeing and talking about today. So Jude, thanks for that lovely intro, and thanks for all of the information too. I think that we could spend almost the whole time just listening to some of these folks who we have as guests today talk, and get so much information from all of them. And I'm so excited to have you all here. So as I was saying, welcome to the second annual Boulder Apple Tree Project Symposium. It's really nice to virtually see everyone. Right now we've got 54 folks here, and I think we have more trickling in as we go. And we're just really excited today. We have, you know, community partners here. We've got a speaker from all the way in Maine. We've got some people from all the way in Washington on the other side of the country. We've got our students, researchers, instructors, and just, you know, apple tree enthusiasts. And so we're just really excited to share this evening filled with apples for you. We just want to briefly acknowledge the support for this project. So this is an NSF funded project largely, and also has funding from the University of Colorado. And of course, many of you have contributed to this wonderful project in various ways, with volunteer hours and with funds. And so we just want to acknowledge all of your wonderful support and thank you for being here today. I would like to do a brief round of introductions, just to let you know sort of who are the wonderful folks who are bringing this symposium to you today, and also who are the wonderful instructional team who have been working for the course of the semester on a lot of the research that you're going to see our students present later in the poster session. So most of you know Amy Dunbar-Wallace, who is our project manager and community coordinator. She is the one who reaches out to the majority of you, and she's just fabulous. She's really responsible for much of what you see today in the symposium in terms of the organization. Deidre Yeager is a BATP instructor and one of our lead project researchers, and she has done a lot of great work with the students this year on fire blight. Michaela Sievers is a graduate student assistant who helped us with teaching the students and with a lot of the graphs that you're going to see tonight. Chance Nelson and Sarah Vipond are here as our BATP class alumni and student researchers, and they will be helping you troubleshoot any technical issues, so you might see them in a breakout room if you have technical issues. Dr. Terry Belinsky, who couldn't be with us tonight, is responsible for a lot of the great research that you're going to see from the students. She's taking a little time to recover from an injury this year, and so Dr. Stephanie Mayer has stepped in to help instruct the class and has graciously stepped in to help with the symposium as well. And of course, we have our wonderful founder who you're going to hear from later, Dr. Katie Suding. So we're very excited to have this wonderful team together to bring you the symposium this evening. And as we embark on our exploration of apples for the day, I just want to briefly acknowledge that these are challenging times, and we've encountered a lot of different challenges over the past year, and being here tonight might be a particularly special effort for many of you, joining from home with different responsibilities, etc. And I just want to say thanks so much for being here today and for your support of this project. Despite, you know, these challenges that we face this year, especially with regard to teaching in a way that was engaging while also trying to collect data and stay safe with regard to COVID, we managed to really collect some exciting data in our eBio 1250 class, which is Intro to Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Research. And our students are going to share that today in the poster session. And, you know, while our research was limited to experiments that could be performed from students' homes or tree sites that we could actually walk to from campus, we really found some great specimens that we think will be great candidates for long-term monitoring and building up a longitudinal data set about apple trees. And also, we piloted some new laboratory techniques that we are hoping to use for years to come. So the students will talk about those efforts and those new techniques a little bit later. And we're really proud of what we've accomplished considering COVID, considering evacuations from Colorado's wildfires, and just the various other challenges that the students have faced this year. And we talk a lot about resilience in science, and I think these students are just, they've really built up a lot of resilience through this project, and I'm super proud of what they have to present. And they're a totally challenge engaging and ready to go group. So very excited to share that with you today. We also have a fantastic lineup of guests, some of whom you are hearing as you entered the room. So Dr. Katie Suding, of course, will be heading off the talks with some talk about the Boulder Apple Tree Project and what we've accomplished over the last year. Dr. Todd Little-Siebold from Maine will talk about his teaching and his research there with the historic apple trees in Maine. And Amelia Brackett Hogstad will talk about the historic apple trees of our region here in Boulder, Colorado. So I'll introduce them as we walk through the program. We also have some really fantastic apple conservation experts, orchardists, and some local cider and spirit industry experts who are going to share with you later in the panels today. So we're excited and looking forward to this whole thing. And I think, yeah, I meant to share some slides as we went through there, but you can just see them there. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of the program, we're going to do the welcome, we'll do speakers, and then we'll move into the students' poster session. After the poster session, we'll reconvene in the main room, and we'll talk briefly about how we're going to do the 2 panels. And then we'll go into the panel sessions and then reconvene in the main room once more for just a debrief session. So this is a virtual symposium, and we just have a couple housekeeping items to go over. So please hold your questions until the end or type your questions into the chat, and the moderator can relay those questions to the speaker. Please stay muted for the entire symposium unless you're asked to unmute by the moderator. And you can raise your hand using the participants function. I'll show you a screenshot of how to do that in a second. We'd also appreciate if you not take screenshots of the different slides. If you would like to have a slide or have that information, please contact the speaker and they can provide that for you. And if you're having any technical issues, please either directly chat Amy Dunbar-Wallace, or email her, and she just put that into the chat as well. A few screenshots to help you out here. Here is your mute and unmute. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom, you can see these 2 functions and use those to show your video or mute yourself, etc. If you would like to see the chat and have it pop out, you can click on it here. And then from the top drop-down menu, choose pop out. And that way you can kind of keep track of what people are saying throughout this symposium. And if you would like to raise your hand, that is under this participants function. So you click here and then raise hand. All right, so with that, I am going to briefly introduce our first speaker. So I would it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Katie Suding. So Katie is a distinguished professor of ecology at the University of Colorado Boulder, and she's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a highly cited author who's written extensively, truly extensively, in the areas of ecosystem dynamics and management, ecological restoration, biodiversity, and conservation. And her current research focuses on managing ecosystems in a rapidly changing world, which we know is what we have today. So in 2018, she received the Robert H. MacArthur Award, which is a very prestigious biennial prize given by the Ecological Society of America to an ecologist for their pivotal contributions to the field. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Katie.
Hi, everyone. I'm just so glad that everyone's here, and it's so exciting to be able to touch base with everyone, even if it is remotely. So I have the pleasure to talk about the Boulder Apple Tree Project and what we've done this year. And I want to say it's a super big we. Actually, I'm on sabbatical right now, and this really should have been probably presented by many of the other team members. But we're, as a group, 2020 has been a great year in many ways, and I just want to say thank you, and also just thank you so much to all the people that are contributing, because the effort is far and wide. Okay, let me have some slides to show. So I'm just going to give you an update, a little bit about the background, about what we're trying to do here. As you probably know, we started the Boulder Apple Tree Project in 2017, 2016. And it was mostly started because I moved back to Colorado. I grew up in Colorado. I moved back and I was struck by that there's apple trees just in my backyard in these vacant lots. And I was struck by the combination of these grand old trees that were just really awe-inspiring, combined with that they're producing edible fruit that are so amazing to eat, way different than the grocery store. And they're right in our backyard. And even growing up in Colorado, I did not realize that this whole aspect of our landscape existed. So our mission in the Boulder Apple Tree Project is threefold. First of all, to connect the ecological and cultural heritage of trees in Boulder County in the Front Range. And now I'm pretty excited about our expansion, thinking about the whole state of Colorado, thinking about ways we can preserve these trees, as well as the stories that these trees hold. It's really awe-inspiring to think about all the time and history these trees have witnessed, and what kind of anchoring they are to the place that we now live. And then thirdly, to further locally relevant engaged research at CU Boulder, but also across a network that we're building of community college partners statewide. Apple trees are a great window into our local kind of place where we live that links us to all these other people who live here too, as well as able to link research, education, as well as community in a way that I think is really, really important. Perhaps most important when you're thinking about education and you're thinking about how do you find passion in your work, and how do you find these questions that you're so passionate about that you really want to explore. And so we feel very strongly to give students that opportunity. So we'll hear a little bit about history of Colorado's apples, as well as history of apple trees in Maine today. Just want to point out that in Colorado, there's a really incredible history of people bringing apple trees here when they moved from the east to the west, as well as when they were expanding and building up the town of Boulder that we know today. And there's a couple different ways that they've put these trees on our landscape. And some of the grand old survivors are still with us today. There were orchards where people planted them for horticultural reasons to try to sell. There are also a lot of homesteads built, and people would bring these trees with them or plant them for their own food. With the good ones they ate, the bad ones maybe they would give to their livestock, and the ones in between maybe they would make as hard cider, even perhaps hard cider to sterilize some water that might be not quite up to healthy standards. And then also through the state, planting a wide variety of trees to figure out what tree and what kind of cultivars work best in this pretty exceptional climate. Very dry, but also has very strong diurnal swings in temperature, as well as on the swing seasons, particularly in the spring, the probability of frosts often occurring. So how do we get these trees on our landscape surviving, particularly in this fairly stressful environment? So we started out, people said, yeah, there's trees around here. Yeah, a lot of them are old. We started out saying, let's map them, let's find them, focusing on Boulder County at first. So we've gone with a bunch, actually, I think there's been over 100 students and volunteers that have been associated with either reporting trees, going out, tagging trees, measuring their characteristics, as well as collecting leaf samples and fruit samples. And we have gone and explored and found more trees than we ever would have imagined here. Trees in people's backyards, trees in empty vacant fields, trees in the middle of nowhere in mountain slopes, all with their own history, all with very diverse in terms of their genetics and cultivar. All in all, we have tagged and surveyed over 700 trees within Boulder County. Each of these trees has a record that you can look up on our interactive map. And we have identified 43 cultivars as part of this survey. About half the trees that we have done genetic work on don't match any known cultivar, and then we have 43 matches. We have found a lot of the heirloom cultivars that we were expecting from historic records. Some of these are well known and really loved by people that have family recipes or particular love of cider across this region. Perhaps more interesting right now is that we're also finding what we're calling local cultivars. So these are genotypes that are missing from the USDA reference database, but they match other trees. So there's these genotypes that were planted here, were used by people here, but they weren't probably the very common varieties, and they perhaps represent lost varieties and perhaps varieties that are rare and local to Boulder or to this region. We're pursuing many of these, and some interesting things about these local cultivars are that they're spread out throughout Boulder, but they have these matches. So there's different trees that are the same genotype. We are struck by that they're almost always located along historic irrigation ditches, which in some ways is not surprising, but it really makes this really clear kind of landscape pattern unfold throughout our community. We also are starting to work with a geneticist at Washington State University to actually look even further into these, to think about their parentage and their grandparentage, to try to figure out what are these cultivars, and are these cultivars truly unique to Boulder and really our local apples. We're also making a big effort to graft these and save these, because we've already lost some of these trees and some of these local cultivars, and so preserving these, as these might be really the special ones that are true Boulder trees. We're also expanding in our discovery phase to think about what these trees do in terms of the landscape context that they're put in. So they were planted over 100 years ago. Boulder has grown up around many of these trees. There's some trees in urban environments, some trees in very agricultural environments. And they're all providing services that we depend on and that they depend on regionally. We're bringing in more professors from the CU faculty to help work on this in terms of ecosystem services, looking at birds and pests and pollination. And just a little kind of more detail about this, and you'll hear about some of this work from the eBio 1250 students this year, is that thinking about trees in different contexts from urban areas all the way to agricultural areas and what they provide and what the landscape provides for them. For instance, how the bird community affects the degree of pest control on these trees and how that relates to the proximity to native forests, or how they affect water infiltration or soil organic matter accumulation in these different areas. And working with the community to think about how do we plan the next step in terms of thinking about where to plant our new orchards that are becoming very, very valuable, and how we think about this across a whole landscape. We're also, as I mentioned, really committed to this idea about power of place in terms of a locally relevant, community engaged education related to CU, first of all, and you'll hear from a ton of really great research. I'm so proud of what we've been able to do in terms of bringing students in and really emphasizing inquiry-based, asking research questions where we really don't know the answer, and really finding out the question or the answers. So last year we've involved 8 summer bridge students, and so these are students that are transitioning from community college to 4-year colleges and doing an authentic research project in the summer. We've also been advised 2 computer science senior capstone projects. And so these have resulted in both an interactive map, so you can go to our website and see what trees, where they are, what they look like, whether there's a cultivar match, as well as right now we're working on a mobile data collection app, so people across the state can go to trees that they know and collect the same standardized data. And so we can build our data set that way. We're in our second iteration of our CURE course. So CURE stands for Course-Based Undergrad Research Experience. The number at CU is 1250. I'm not going to talk about too much about that right now because that is the showcase of this symposium. We also are expanding these cures, one history cure that I think Amelia is going to talk about, and then actually 2 alum from last year's cure course are involved in this year as undergraduate assistants. It's been a truly impressive experience. We're also expanding statewide, and just kind of to think about the whole state of Colorado, there were many historic orchard districts throughout the state, both on the western slope as well as the eastern slope of Colorado. And these ranged widely across the state, different economic situations, as well as different climates. They all produced apples for at least in the turn of the century. And then as the in the 20s, 30s, 40s, a lot of these orchard producing areas hit hard times and the orchards were abandoned, but there's still remnants pretty much across all these areas. One interesting thing is that these historic apple districts were started over a century ago, but you can overlay, you can overlay this among the population density that Colorado's has now. And you can see that there's some areas where these orchard districts are now very urbanized areas, and there's other areas that are much more agricultural roots. And so thinking about this as a statewide network, we're really able to look at all these different contexts of these historic trees in their current culture, economic environment. And so what we're trying to do is think about these historic orchard districts. We are partnering with several community colleges and instructors to expand cures across the state, as well as community nonprofit organizations to make the research done across the state with these colleges and students really relevant, both locally as well as statewide. And so if you think about this in terms of a network on networks, that we're working to base these different research questions across the state of Colorado, where maybe the same question could be asked in different contexts, as well as within each of these sites across Colorado, thinking about urban to agricultural gradients and how that might be affecting these interactions in these trees, as well as within tree questions that you'll hear about a lot today that are relevant to apple production, as well as sustainable agriculture at a more landscape scale. So our vision overall, just thinking about in the looking towards the future, is we're working to establish community teaching orchards to bring some of these really unique local cultivars closer to people so that they can actually witness all the amazing diversity that apples hold, preserve our unique trees, both in Boulder and then expanding throughout Colorado, and reach more students, particularly at the community college level, and linking that through bridge programs to four-year universities. Okay, so I'm gonna pass it off now, but thank you so much for coming. And I just wanted to advertise two things that you might be interested in if you want to learn more. First of all, we've had an undergrad at the CU College of Engineering complete a video bike tour of Boulder apples with interviews and ways to kind of experience these apples on the landscape it's just amazing to what she has done. And then another thing that you can look at through our website is we have an online museum exhibit in partnership with the CU Natural History Museum, has a broad amount of information from our interactive map to oral histories to more information. And this was in conjunction with another undergraduate research project, undergraduate in the history department who looked at the apples in the context of untold stories of women and children and how that kind of affected our communities. Okay. Thank you so much. I really am excited for the rest of our time here, and really glad that everyone's here.
All right. Thank you so much, Katie. You can use the little expressions down at the bottom of Zoom. I think that they're called, let's see, what are they called exactly? Reactions, if you want to clap your hands. So thanks so much. I'm going to ask everybody to hold their questions to the end because I talked too long at the beginning, so sorry about that, but we will make sure that you get a chance to ask your questions. And I would like to introduce Dr. Little-Siebold, Todd Little-Siebold, who is a professor of history and Latin American studies at the College of the Atlantic in Bay Harbor, Maine. He has been teaching this really cool course called The History of Agriculture, Apples, so it's about apples, for several years. And in this course, students explore the fascinating history of the apples of Maine and the economic and ecological importance of apples, and a little bit of cider making for good measure, because, you know, why not? So Todd also organizes the Maine Apple Camp, which participants learn about different aspects of apple history and cultivation and biology in conjunction with the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. And he has the goal of preserving the traditional varieties of apples that are historic to Maine. So I will go ahead and hand it over. And Todd, you can go ahead and share your slides whenever you are ready.
Okay, here we go. It's going to take a second. And you see, is it presenting yet?
It's presenting. We see your PowerPoint.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody. I wanted to start out by just saying that it's really exciting to hear about your work. You're definitely what I call fellow travelers, people who are interested in the similar kinds of things. Kathy's conversation about the recognition of the history in the backyards is really very similar to my journey. I'm trained as a Latin American historian and really got into apples in a serious way about 10 years ago, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Our project is very similar to yours, focused on the College of the Atlantic and an undergraduate class that I teach, and then the work of the Maine Heritage Orchard at the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. This tree that you see here is 11.5 feet in circumference. It's associated with a house that's has as its founding date 1827. We think the tree is roughly 200 years old, maybe a little bit older, maybe older than the house, and is not typical. This is obviously sort of a record kind of tree. It's about 5.5 miles from the College of the Atlantic, and is what I refer to as ancient apple trees that have sort of become my niche obsession, is tracking down the very oldest trees in Eastern Maine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work, and then later we'll have some questions. So I live and work in down East Maine. I teach at the College of the Atlantic, 325 undergraduate students total at the college. Everybody gets a degree in human ecology, which is a self-designed interdisciplinary degree program where students basically pursue their own interests and faculty advise them, very much in the inquiry-based kind of project-based kind of work that you all do through the program you're doing. I've been doing the apple work for about 10 years. I've been very interested in local apple trees for much longer, but actually started to learn how to identify grafted trees and do research on them about 10 years ago. And one of the most important things I do is we've built a collection of almost 300 varieties in the Maine Heritage Orchard at Mafka. And we have approximately 100 others that are basically in waiting in the nursery. So within a couple years, we'll probably have something like 400 varieties of apples. I was not trained in agricultural history per se, though I did study the agricultural history of Guatemala. So this is really a passion project that sort of flowered because I teach at a place that allows me to do basically anything that I want, which has been an extraordinary privilege. For people in Colorado, it's probably worth saying that our history is an unusual one in Maine because we have a history that could stretch back as far as the 1550s with the introduction of apples by Basque fishermen on offshore islands where they were fishing and drying cod, maybe even before Christopher Columbus arrived, though no documented evidence of that, but certainly by 1511. So our history is quite deep, stretching back to then the French settling in 1613, the English in the southern part of the state, 1608. After years, literally 100 years of warfare between the French and English, most of the rest of Maine is settled in the 1760s. We then have introductions from Canada as well, new waves of European imports, and then Western varieties, like ones potentially that emerge in places like Wisconsin, Colorado, elsewhere, that come back east. So we have extremely high diversity of varieties, and many different historical layers that each one sort of needs its own sort of historical techniques. Imperial warfare between the French and English really defines the history of Maine, such that you can really study specific areas where I know that French were settled here in 1613, and so it really allows us to do some really targeted research. Maine becomes an early apple exporter very early on, 2 million barrels of apples a year by about 1860. And it's exporting all over the world and all around the country, and then is slowly replaced in the 20th century by places like Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. One thing that makes our hunt for apples maybe easier in some ways is many of our orchards were abandoned before they were grafted over to a few commercial varieties. Places like New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts all went through a radical simplification in the 1920s, where a few varieties, 6, 7, were grafted in almost all the orchards. A lot of our orchards were abandoned in the 20s and 30s before that process took place. So we have extremely high diversity in the relict orchards here, essentially because of a combination of the Depression and a test winter in 1932-33 that killed 1 in 3 trees in Maine and basically crippled our commercial orcharding industry. So hundreds and hundreds of orchards are basically just abandoned, as they were in 1930 before they were simplified. So we have extremely high diversity. We have a lot, probably 600 to 1,000 named varieties planted in Maine. I was telling people at the beginning that we discover new ones every day. They are extremely well documented. Maine has a combination of sources and historical archives that make it one of the best, I think, documented places that has extant orchards. Between the Massachusetts Horticultural Society before 1820, Maine Horticultural Society, and then a very important book for us, The Apples of Maine, by Frederick Bradford, who was a horticulturalist, got a University of Maine degree in 1917, and did a survey of every known variety grown in Maine up to that point, 1914. So we actually have a pretty good set of documentation that basically I have seen very few places that have been that lucky. And also early conservation efforts. There were people here beginning to preserve heirloom varieties by 1900. And there's a sort of continuity of preservation here that has made that job a little easier. Because of that documentation, we can actually identify almost every orchard in every town in Maine. So we know where to look. We know who grew things. We're able to connect specific farms with specific varieties and go look for them. So because of the documentation, I wouldn't say our job is easier, because this represents literally hundreds of thousands of trees, but it gives us places to look that makes tracking down the varieties a lot easier. In Maine, I would say we started our efforts, particularly on the right, you'll see a picture of my colleague and friend, John Bunker, who is sort of he's referred to the apple whisperer here in Maine. And sort of nationally recognized as one of the early conservationists, who moved back to the land in the 1970s just in time to get to know the old timers who remembered all the varieties. So this is 1976, 1975. And so John began to become very curious about this and began collecting apples from that previous generation who had collected apples. And so there was this continuity of preservation. And I say just in the nick of time because it was literally it would have been a 20-year period in which many of those would have been lost. His role as a visionary and charismatic advocate for apples has really made Maine one of the sites where over 40 years there's been this growing groundswell of interest in apples. Every year at the Common Ground Country Fair, people bring us between 300 and 600 apple samples to try to identify. John sits down over the winter. I'm trying to train myself to do this to figure out what they are. And we've been able to build a team of folks who really have a long-term vision, that understand that what we're doing is passing the baton in a relay race of keeping these apples alive for different reasons. And I'll try to remember to talk a little bit later, but for example, that tree in Tremont that's 11.5 feet in circumference was planted during part of the Little Ice Age, and would have had some serious environmental stresses that are very different from today, and has survived through many, many changes. And then in our case, an institution willing to say yes, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, who has committed to keep the orchard going in perpetuity. So the first part is exploring and discovering. This apple tree on the right is one that we call the Sweeney Place. It's a tree that we've documented basically reaching somewhere back into the earliest part of the 19th century. The Sweeney family has been on that farm since 1827. And I just recently spoke to one of the family members who's in her 80s that said that she remembers the tree basically exactly the same size when she was small, because many of these very, very old trees really stop growing substantially after a certain age. And so these are extraordinarily rare. This is the apple itself on the left. And what's interesting about a tree like this is for the 1820s, if we think this tree was planted 1810 to 1820, the number of varieties that this could be that are known varieties is relatively short, dozens and dozens as opposed to hundreds and hundreds. So our task in identifying this and figuring out whether it's a unique cultivar, local cultivar, as Kathy said, or a named variety is actually quite easy. We can look at nursery catalogs from Maine and Massachusetts from 1800 to 1820 and sort of figure out what was available and winnow down the list. The next stage is obviously, like you all are doing, documenting and researching, going through historical archives, trying to figure out who was doing what with the apples. This is an early photograph from Lowell, Maine, of a harvest season apple press that would have been taken down and put up seasonally to make cider. Great picture. It documents the pile of apples on the left, how apples and pumice were treated, the barrels of apples and cider, as well as the individual with the rifle on the right, which we can't quite figure out what that's about, but certainly felt like he needed to be armed. And these sorts of things spin out into research projects to find the individuals involved and that sort of stuff. I wanted to foreground a story that Addie and Jude from Cortez shared with me about Ellsworth Porter. We talked about it the first time they came to the Maine Apple Camp a couple of years ago. On the right is a picture of Ellsworth Porter's and others award-winning apples at the St. Louis Columbian Exhibition in 1907. So we know what he grew. We know that he won prizes for it. And he came from a small town in Maine called Mount Vernon. This is on the left, his father and mother and sister. That's their farm. And then in the middle is his house in McElmo Canyon in Cortez. And one of the real questions is, what did he carry with him? What did he find and take with him? When he left Mount Vernon about 1880 at the age of 16, and ends up eventually just settling in this remote canyon that is about as different from Mount Vernon as one could possibly imagine. This actually story, as well as one other, really drew me to the fact that unless we worked with people in Colorado and Ohio and Washington and Oregon, we may not ever find some of the Maine apples, because our Maine apples may not be in Maine anymore. So one of the reasons we started reaching out and building connections nationally is the recognition that that our apples, quote unquote, our apples, may very well be in other people's backyards, not in Maine. Preserve. So this is a former gravel pit that the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association began to renovate into terraces and a conservation orchard in 2014. You can see here at the top are the terraces. We got a USDA NRCS grant to do the terracing to try to stabilize this slope. Now we have 300 trees here, and it's a collaborative effort. Basically, every year fruit explorers find new trees, we graft them into a nursery, and then slowly they'll get planted out in this site. And the idea was to demonstrate polyculture and new uses for degraded lands by putting fruit production in areas that would not be viable for other forms of agriculture. And the trees have done amazingly well, given that this is super dry soils, sandy soils, and we've had 4 years of drought here. It's been remarkable to see the trees flourish. I should say that the orchard manager of this is a former undergraduate from the College of the Atlantic, Laura Seeger, who is the orchard manager now at MAFCA, and has become basically, from my perspective, one of the now top experts on heirloom apple conservation and identification in the field. I mean, amazing expertise. And then the next step after preserving is you scale and repeat. You involve more people, you train and inspire, and unfortunately you have to raise more money. So as Kathy and others know, this is not free. So as we've moved forward, we're moving to build an endowment to permanently preserve the trees and ensure that the collection is preserved forever, whatever that means, as long as humanly possible. And also looking at other techniques or other ways of preserving the rarest ones, such as cryogenic preservation potentially, so that if something were to happen to the orchard. We also have a stewardship program. So every tree in the orchard, there are at least 2 people who have an exemplar of that apple in their backyard. So we have backup copies around the state. This apple is one, it's very funny to me. It is literally 1/4 of a mile from my house, and I finally went over and looked at it. It turns out it's probably a 180 to 200-year-old tree. I name every apple after the place we find it. This is the Bernal Tate place, and it has a lovely little small crab apple that is about 2.5 inches wide and extremely delicious. The projects we're currently working on, obviously expanding the heritage orchard, we think we'll end up with between 600 and 700 apple varieties in that. We're continuing to do the Maine Apple Camp, which is a sort of networking and inspiration site for people from around the country and the state of Maine. We go to a remote camp on a lake in Maine and just talk apples and conservation and cider for 2 days. As with you all, we're working with Cameron Peace at Washington State University to try to fingerprint some of these, figure out their pedigrees, answer some of the unanswerable questions about whether Spanish apples are in fact on these offshore islands by doing some of that work. We're beginning to collaborate with others on an heirloom collections database, just to sort of describe who has what where. I teach classes at the College of the Atlantic on the history of apples every year. John and I have taken students to England to look at cider culture and apple culture there. Also Spain, Asturias, northern Spain, which has a 1,000-year cider history. And then this year I'm teaching a class called the Cider Project, where we're making hard cider for hopefully drinkable for the college's 50th anniversary next fall as a celebration. And then finally, I'm working on a book that's a history of cider apples. Apples explicitly defined as for cider in America. Lessons learned, it takes a team. You have to have a team because you will not be able to accomplish this alone. The work is too big, and we all pay attention differently to different matters. You need both individuals and institutions, as you all have. Like-minded people, they're allies. We've discovered allies everywhere, both in the state and beyond. And I think one of the things that I would say is the urgency is that the trees are still out there, but the old timers are few. And the people who can tell us still point to a tree and say, well, that's a northern greening, are only a handful. So the urgency is really about the loss of information, not necessarily, though we do lose old trees every year, it's about losing that thread of memory. So that's what makes things so urgent. These are the fellow travelers. Laura Seeger in the middle, who's the orchard manager, a former student of mine, did undergraduate research on apple varieties, and then John on the right. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Todd, and and everybody has totally got the hand clapping thing down. We will unmute at some point and do a round of applause for everyone so that it's not quite so silent. So thanks so much, and I just wanted to point out a couple of great things that sort of are great segues before I introduce our next speaker. So we have a wonderful expert, Gail Volk here, who is going to be on one of our panels and knows a ton about germplasm preservation. And so the cryogenics and stuff that Todd mentioned, she could definitely answer some great questions about that. And I believe that I'll go ahead now and introduce our next speaker. So next we have Amelia. I'm just pulling up your bio here, Amelia. Hold on, just need my notes. All right. Okay, so sorry, everybody. Okay, so Amelia is a PhD candidate in our history department at CU Boulder and a fellow at the Center for the Study of Origins more recently. And in spring 2020, Amelia taught a Boulder Apple Tree Project affiliated undergraduate research course titled Environmental History at Home. And Amelia and her team of volunteers have collected numerous interviews and stories and articles through different community history days. And she's just got a whole archive that she has provided us with of apple tree information. Amelia has also mentored some fantastic UROP students, in particular, Emily Ray, who's helped her out a lot with her work, and has helped her prepare proportions of the Boulder Apple Tree Project online museum exhibit. And she's also mentored some summer bridge students who were transferring from community colleges to research universities. So she's been a really big part of our project for a long time. And it is my pleasure to introduce Amelia Brackett Hogstad. Amelia, you want to go ahead and share your slides?
Yes. Okay. Great, so thank you for that introduction. And I just want to say thank you for having me, and also congrats to putting on a virtual symposium. As Lisa mentioned, my class was in the spring earlier this year, and so about half of it was in person, and then it very quickly changed, and it was pretty hard to pull off. So just congrats to everybody for doing really well on this. And so like Lisa said, my name is Amelia. I am a PhD student in the history department, and I focus on environmental history. So my dissertation actually doesn't have anything to do with plants, but it is also an environmental history, and I focus on the history of wildlife conservation in particular. So before I dive into a little bit about kind of what I've been able to do with some of the wonderful folks that Lisa mentioned, I wanted to just take a moment and give us a really basic idea of what environmental history means. So environmental history starts with the basic assumption that you cannot understand this without this, and you cannot understand this without this. That's a tree. You can see the wonderful graphics that I was treating my students to in the spring. So basically, right, that human and environmental, or natural history as we sometimes call it, it cannot be understood without each other, right? They're intertwined. And the environment affects humans, and humans, of course, affect the environment. And we are pretty familiar with this now, right, when we talk about climate change and the Anthropocene. But this is just one of those things that is critical to my field in particular. So I want to also talk a little bit about, this is an interdisciplinary project, and especially for the students here, kind of what do you get and by picking different types of disciplines to work in, and then what is important about working together, right? Because I think that's one of the great things that our project does. So according to the program, the title of this talk is Gathering and Archiving Historical Data. And I think that really signals one of the main ways that historians, or people who are trained with historical skills, can help interdisciplinary projects like this one, right? So we can help scientists access historical documents to answer their questions, right? So for example, on this project, I put together a spreadsheet that one column was the different decades, starting probably in the 1860s and going through to, I want to say 1950s or 60s. And then on the other column was all of the cultivars that were mentioned in that particular era, and so I was using my ability to go and find some historical documents, and then I was providing that information to the folks who were doing genetic testing to narrow down what they were looking for, right? And saying, okay, well, we know that this type of cultivar was mentioned in the 1890s, and we know that this tree could be about that old, and it's in this location, so we'll start here, right? So that's one way that we can work together. But one of the things I like to talk about when working on teams like this is kind of the important difference between data and sources. So I really like to talk about with my students what's special about a historical source, right? It's not something that we get to create. We don't go into a lab or go out into the field. In some cases, we can through oral histories, of course, which I'll talk about in a minute. But for the most part, we are really beholden to what has been left behind by previous generations of people. And so that can be challenging, but it can also be really interesting. And it means that the context of our sources is really important. So when I'm working with students, and I think I've maybe had 2, maybe 3 students ever who have been history majors. So I really start with the basics. And I like to start with this. Here we go. This source, which is from 1897, and you can actually find it at our local history library, which is part of the Boulder Public Library system. It's right up on Broadway and Pine, if anybody knows that area. But it is it's a publication called The Irrigation Era. And I like to start students with this because, as you can see even from the front, it's this really beautiful, hand-drawn piece. And it's really trying to tell a story. You can see the mountains in the back. You see on the bottom left, there's water, and then you can see rows of agriculture. There's even an orchard there, right? And so this source is kind of a rich place to start for students. And so present it to them, and we usually talk about what it says, what the tone of it is, and I'll actually just read you this excerpt, just a short piece of what's on the screen, because I think it's pretty worth it to get the point. So this is the first paragraph in this publication, and it's talking about Boulder specifically, Boulder County and the city in particular. Its wealth of gold and silver, fruits and grains, abundance of water for irrigation, and matchless climate. These are the natural elements of greatness that are just at this time attracting more attention than any territory of Western America. So looking at this from today, we might know, living here in Colorado, for those of us who are here in this area, that this isn't potentially naturally a very wet type of climate, right? Certainly there is a lot of irrigation in this area. And so I like to ask my students, what's going on here? Why would this have been created? What does the tone tell you? What questions do you have? And so we kind of get at the importance of context and thinking about who created this and for what purpose, right? So it's pretty clear, it's some type of advertisement. And of course, those of us who are familiar with these type of sources, it's from a boosters club, right? So these were groups of people who were really interested in bringing out both labor and people to work the land, and also capital investment, right? People who are trying to attract money, largely from the East Coast, to come and get invested in this area to expand development, right? And so that's what this is about, right? This is kind of selling an idea that's not even really, it's not in the land, right, at this time. And so it's kind of this really great example that if you took this excerpt and just read it, you wouldn't actually be able to get any information from it, right? You wouldn't be able to tell, well, maybe Boulder is a wealth of gold and silver and fruits and grains, right? But that's not really what this source is telling us. And so I like to talk about this kind of thing with students and early on working with interdisciplinary teams, because it's just kind of a different approach. And we are, as historians, primed to ask these kinds of questions to the point where it becomes second nature for us, hopefully. But it's not something that everybody is always encouraged to think about. So I think that's one of the kind of exciting things about working together. So yeah, just to summarize, historical sources need context, and they can also provide depth and give you some insight into why people have done things in the past, and some of the consequences of those actions potentially, and also to give you an idea of the daily experiences, right, of what people were experiencing and going through, and kind of what it meant, for example, to plant an apple orchard, so. I also just want to focus in the rest of my talk on my students and the wonderful people I've been able to work with. So Lisa kind of mentioned, what we've been able to do history-wise here. We had 2 student interns through the history department. We've had 3 bridge program assistants, all of whom were really identified as kind of STEM background folks and people who are interested in going into the sciences in particular. But they got to hang out with me for a month and learn about, how to do history. So they're in the corner there at that table. And actually, Vanessa has the irrigation era there in front of her. So, that was a particularly fun experience as well. And then I also was super lucky to have about 20 students in my history cure earlier this year. And there we all are on our last day of class. Again, it changed quite dramatically what we had hoped to do. We had been planning to do a lot of in-person research and oral histories, and obviously that did not happen. But we had a really great time. And then I also was part of the Europe assistant group this summer. And for those of you, that is just research assistants that are funded by the university. So we're lucky enough to have that kind of program here at CU. And you'll learn more about Eliza and Emily's work later, I think. And so, yeah, these are the kinds of things that my students were working with, right? So predominantly the historical documents that reference apple trees in this area are going to be newspapers and advertisements, some nursery catalogs, some government publications, particularly in the 1870s and in the 1920s, a number of photographs actually, which is pretty neat. Students always, everybody really engages with those, right? And then of course, we've got some really great maps here actually, and some aerial photography. And so, there are certain challenges to working with each one of those different types of sources. And, it's always like with nursery catalogs, for example, I had a student working on those. And it's one thing, again, as those of us who work with these sources know, it's one thing to establish the existence of a nursery catalog and referencing certain cultivars, but it's completely another to try to go the next step and see, well, was anybody buying those apple trees? Was this a successful business? Who are they selling to? That kind of thing. So it can be challenging, of course, to pull off in a semester this kind of detailed local history work. But I think it can be rewarding because with each source, kind of like we did with the irrigation era, you get to ask these questions and practice those skills. And then so, we also did some oral history work, right? Which is basically, it's a way of talking to other people, generally people who have direct experience, right, from something you're interested in the past. And usually, you can get some more detailed, like fact-based information from those interviews. Where was the orchard? What cultivars were there? You can ask those questions and sometimes you can get answers. But also one of the things that we emphasized, the students that I was working with, and even the volunteers, especially, and wonderful volunteers that we were all working with, was also trying to understand people's experiences with apples and really, why does it matter? Why do apples matter to you? How did you use them? What did they taste like? These kinds of things that don't often get caught in the actual documents. Often people are writing down news events, so-and-so died and he had this many apples, but that doesn't really tell you what drove him to plant those apples, or what his kids were doing, right? Were they invested in that orchard in some way? So that's a really great resource that, with some training, you can do your own oral history too, and it's quite a rewarding experience. And then another thing that was kind of exciting in terms of new stuff that we were doing, new for me at least, were these things called community history events. And this probably took the biggest hit from COVID, but we were able to get one with actually, pretty good turnout about a little over a year ago from now. And the idea behind these events originally came to me because I was kind of like running around different neighborhoods and talking to somebody at their house, and then they'd say, well, in order to really understand, you got to talk to that person because he's the one who actually took care of the trees, and then so and so down the block was the one who would always make them into cider and all this stuff, and before every interview I would do, I would get like a dozen more people to talk to, which on one hand is awesome, but on the other hand I thought, well, maybe it'd be more efficient just to get everybody together. And, usually with oral histories and sort of recorded conversations, you really want to have as few people as possible so that you can capture that specific person's story. You don't have somebody coming in telling them, oh, that's not how it worked, or, that kind of thing. But I thought, well, it could actually be really interesting to get these neighborhood level communities together, because then I could ask questions about, well, what did you all use the apple trees for? And whose neighbor, like whose house did you go to? And these kind of more community-based conversations and questions. And in the event that we did, it actually kind of worked pretty well. People were talking about the different parties that people would have and the ways that they actually felt more connected to their neighbors and to the places where the place where they lived because of these apple trees, right? And so that's really a great example of apple trees having an impact and actually helping to create human connections and human communities. And so just on the screen there are some examples of some of the types of questions that we asked. And this was in addition to more sort of fact-finding questions, about like who planted the trees and that kind of thing. But we also really wanted to sort of end every event. And again, we were successful with one before COVID hit, but the idea was kind of to end each event asking, what value did these trees have to you? We wanted to talk to people, not only as people who could give us information about the trees, but also as people who had vested interests. And so, we established the history of these trees. What do you think the importance is? Asking the people that we were working with directly, what better group of people to talk to and make decisions, right, about their apple trees. And so, there we go. Yeah, and so, just in terms of what history can bring, I think, it helps us to ask new questions and prioritize context and not only prioritize things that can be kind of stripped down and cleaned, right, in terms of data. But then also, I think it is a really fun opportunity for all of us, scientists, historians, and everybody to get together and actually engage and learn from community sources and partners, to kind of mix all of these different approaches together and talk to people. Because, again, at those events, Amy came in and she would give a grafting, like a little, how do you do this thing? So we really mixed it up, right? And we really mixed up this information and sort of tried to serve the people that we were talking to as much as we were trying to, also get some information, some of our questions answered. Just got this one last slide, and I wanted to come back to the class in particular, but also just to the various students that I've been lucky enough to work with, and highlight a few of the things that students have particularly been interested in, that they themselves researched and discovered and kind of went through that archival process. So first, I had a student who really found a personal connection to Boulder's history by researching the role of Latino families and laborers in Boulder's agricultural economy. And so it's not really come up so much in Apple history, but if you broaden a little bit beyond that for Boulder's agricultural history, Latino families are critical to that, right, in Latino labor. And so, you know, she herself, she's from California and she's very connected to her family in Mexico. And when she came to Boulder, she's a freshman, she didn't really feel connected to this place. I can imagine several reasons why, I mean, we discussed them, but she really felt connected from learning the history and the impact of, effectively her own people, and she really felt that connection. So that's something that she researched on her own. She came to me with that concept, and I was like, great, let's do it, let's go for it. I had another student who actually showed how there were agricultural advertisements in the 50s and 60s that were sort of targeting this area, that drew on mid-century ideas of like feminine consumption, right? And this sort of class-based luxury, which I thought was really neat because he was looking at all these different advertisements. And generally, I think of those as two different things, right? I think about, okay, well, there's the agricultural history of the mid-century, right? And then there's the suburban history. And he was finding a place where they were kind of sort of mixed up all together and kind of intersecting. Then I had another student who made this really compelling, organized argument that apples were really critical to this one, this agricultural town that's up sort of, well, I'm in Louisville, so it's directly north of me, but then it's, if you're in Boulder, looking at Boulder on the map, it's a little bit northeast. But anyway, it's this really critical, important agricultural location for the county. And she made the argument that apples were actually really important to hygiene's cultural history, and how families kind of educated their kids. And she found all these different examples in addition to being food, right, or being used for cider. And part of that is because they're such a versatile fruit too. And then finally, I did actually have a student who was able to interview two descendants of a family that was one of the original rancher homesteader families in the area. And that was really great to see as well. And also we got some great information from it, but she did the research and she did the whole thing all on her own. And I was just there kind of to be tech support, and so anyway, these are some of the kind of awesome things that we get to do working with students. And so that's what I've got.
Right. Thank you so much, Amelia. And I'm actually going to hand this over to Amy for a brief question and answer session now.
Okay, so we have had several questions in the chat, and one Courtney just asked about the grafting. And so last year we tried to have a grafting session and we were upended by COVID a little bit. So I put a grafting video on YouTube. It's a very, very basic grafting, but hopefully we'll be able to gather again in March. I know Eric Johnson locally of Widespread Malice also does some grafting workshops. What we're hoping to do in March, if you bring your scion material, we will help teach you how to graft that and how to care for it so that it'll grow up into a big, lovely tree for your yard. So I would like to open up questions that people had in the chat. And one question early on that was for Todd. Let me get back a little bit higher here in the chat.
From Michael, yeah?
Yes, Michael, would you like to repeat your question?
Uh-oh, he's wandered away from the camera.
Uh-oh, let me find it here. I'm sorry.
I can answer the question. So
okay.
he was asking whether these were seedling trees or grafted varieties. And probably the most important question that we ask people when they bring us fruit is to tell us about the tree. Because basically, if it's grafted, obviously it could have a name. If it's not grafted, it's very likely a seedling, right? And I always tell people that, if we think of this as detective work, let's assume it's a seedling unless there's evidence otherwise. And I think people are always disappointed by that because they think they may have some really important lost variety. But we have both very old cultivated seedling trees that are probably not grafted, and then ones that are very old, clearly grafted. And then about a third that fall in this category that we like to use widely, which is ambiguous, because we can't determine that. So Michael's question is really at the heart of this, which is we have to figure out which ones to waste time on, you know, trying to figure out what they are. And we will spend an hour to 3 hours reading over the 7-volume history of apples in America by Dan Bussey, trying to compare the structure of the apple to identify it. So, but I would say that we tend to really focus on cultivated trees that we think may very well, which means often in our area in a big vase pattern that it's been pruned and that sort of stuff that has evidence of cultivation. But we certainly have some very, very old seedlings because our farms start to be abandoned in the 1850s and 60s.
Todd, I have a further question for you about your student cider class. So did they have specific apples or specific trees that they were gathering from, or were they much more take all comers with the apples? What were they looking for?
Yeah, so what we did is they had, one of the assignments was what I called Apple Exploration Journal, which they had to go out and identify apples and then characterize and evaluate their cider qualities. So we started out by tasting traditional cider varieties so they could tell what bitterness was, what astringency was. And so their goal was to go out and find primarily seedling trees, which are the most interesting ones around here for cider, and then collect those. And then about mid-term, everybody had an assignment. I gave them 2 bushels and I said, you must go get 2 bushels of excellent apples. Because of the lack of fruit this year, that was more challenging than it should have been. But then we did a major pressing and we have about 25 gallons of cider bubbling away in one of the office buildings at campus. But really the goal there was for them to learn how to identify which apples are good for cider. And then they had to map exactly where, like what you all do, they had to map exactly where the trees were. There's a little bit of a super cool hip movement now for people to graft weirdo seedling trees that they find that they think are really good for cider. And those have begun to be sold, some of them through Fudco Trees, through John Bunker's, the Fudco Trees that he began, but also lots of the cider makers are propagating things that they think are particularly interesting.